Hey guys, Heidi Preep here. Today we are continuing the series on family roles, and I wanted to address the topic of family scapegoating with a lot of kind of safety cones around it, because of all the family roles, this is the family role that is the most likely to have experienced abuse at the hands of their family members. Psychological abuse is kind of inherent to the role. So if you were scapegoated by your family, you were psychologically abused. The term scapegoating is a term that describes psychological abuse. And there may also have been other forms of abuse present. So I just want to start out by saying that if you recognize yourself in this role, and if you recognize yourself as dealing with the problems that I'm going to go over in the rest of this video, I highly recommend seeing a therapist or mental health professional who can help you understand and work through some of the issues that you're probably facing as an adult in this role. So I am going to give suggestions as we go through. There are lots of different types of therapy or lots of different support groups you could seek out. There are books that I really love that deal very specifically and directly with family scapegoating, as well as with some of the mental health conditions that might come alongside it. But I just wanted to start this out by noting that this is a kind of serious and somber topic today. Like a lot of personality systems that we talk about are kind of fun and upbeat and we're celebrating our strengths, but dysfunctional family roles focus more on what went really wrong. So today's video might be a little bit triggering for some people because, again, family scapegoating is a form of abuse, and discovering this role and the fact that you fit into it might be the first time that you have that language for what you've gone through, which can in and of itself be a very disorienting experience. So take care of yourself while you're watching this video, while you're exploring these terms, and if you can, try to seek out a mental health professional who works with these roles and can help you understand and contextualize what happened to you within them. Now, in the last video where I introduced the family roles, we talked very briefly about what each one of them is. But today I want to go a lot deeper with the role of the family scapegoat and talk about how it shows up in childhood, how it shows up in adulthood, and how, if you recognize yourself to be in this role as an adult, you can navigate it with a little bit more clarity and consciousness and end the cycle of putting yourself continuously in situations where you are being scapegoated. So first, let's do an overview and go a little bit more in depth as to what the scapegoat is. So a dysfunctional family system can be thought of as a family system that serves the emotional needs of the parents above and before the needs of the child. This is often called a narcissistic family. However, I don't love using that term because it's a little bit misleading. You don't need to have someone with narcissistic personality disorder in the family in order for it to follow this pattern of dysfunction, but it will most often show up when there is a parent who has some level of narcissism to them. However, again, that doesn't mean that they have NPD. It could be that they have another cluster B disorder in which narcissism is kind of a co-occurring trait. So a lot of the time, this looks like a parent who had severe abuse in their own childhood, who never properly healed from it, and didn't learn proper emotional regulation strategies. So their responses to their own children are very disoriented and very confusing for the child. That parent might not be classified as having narcissistic personality disorder, but the reason we call it a narcissistic family is because the system itself is oriented around ensuring that the emotional needs of the parent are either met or at the least not severely triggered, as opposed to the parent taking complete responsibility for their own emotional regulation, as well as the parental responsibility of meeting the physical and emotional needs of the children. So the role of the family scapegoat is the role of the child who one or more of the parents projects all of their own negative qualities onto. So let's say you have a parent who has really intense rage issues because maybe they have unhealed trauma or they have an attachment style that they have never found the proper coping strategies for. But that parent can't deal with the fact that they have extreme rage because it isn't compatible with the image they have of themselves in their head of them being a good and loving parent. So if they fly off the handle and start screaming at one of their children, they might tell themselves to justify that it's because this kid is just a bad apple. This kid is the reason I get so angry. It must be the fault of the child that I have these rage issues or this drinking issue or these problems at work. So instead of looking inward and figuring out why they're experiencing so much emotional difficulty, the parent will project all of that difficulty onto one child and decide that if it were not for this child, they would not have any of these problems. Now, you might have a parent in this case who has borderline personality disorder or something similar, and they might engage in splitting. So splitting is when you can only see people in a certain circumstance as all good or all bad. And often people who suffer from extreme emotional regulation difficulties will split a singular person. So one day their boyfriend or their partner is the absolute best person in the world, and the next day they're the absolute worst and they can do no right. But in dysfunctional family systems, what we often see is a splitting between children. So you will have the scapegoat whom the parent projects all of their negative qualities onto, and that child can do no right. But you will also have the golden child, who the parent projects all of their positive qualities onto, and that child can do no wrong. And again, this often happens because the parent may have been a victim of abuse or trauma, and so they developed a very, very black or white thinking about people. They do believe in their own mindset people are all good or all bad, and they project this onto their children instead of seeing them as imperfect but lovable human beings who are doing the best that they can. So there isn't necessarily an even-tempered view of people. People are all one way or another. So in these family systems where you have both a golden child and a scapegoat, the parent treats these children almost entirely different. Everything the golden child does is considered wonderful and perfect and a brilliant reflection of the parent's own positive qualities, and everything the scapegoat does is considered bad and not good enough and a reflection of everything the parent hates about themselves. So they are skewing their perception to see one child as flawless and another child as inherently flawed. But the problem is that there's also a gaslighting process that happens. So the parent usually cannot admit to themselves, I love one child more than the other, or I value one child more than the other, or I see my children as unequal in my own mind. So what they tell themselves to compensate for this split is that one child is just a bad child. They love all of their children equally. It just so happens that one of them is really good and the other one is really bad. And this is the message that they tell their children. So you often, with scapegoating abuse, have a very disorienting scenario where children are being treated very differently, but they're being told, I treat you all the same. I love you all the same, I respect you all the same, and the reason that you're getting worse treatment is just because you're a bad person. In the book The Fantasy Bond by Robert Firestone, he talks about how it would actually be better for abused children to be told, I don't love you by the parent who's abusing them, rather than being told, I love you, and then suffering abuse at the hands of that parent, whether it's physical or psychological or emotional abuse. Because children believe what they're told. So if a child is being told, I love you, and then they're having things projected onto them, they're being told they're a bad person, they're being told that they are the reason mommy or daddy is so angry, mommy or daddy drinks, whatever it is, the child will learn to fuse abuse and love. They believe what is happening to me is love. And the only logical explanation that a child can come up with in most cases for why they are being abused by someone who loves them so much is that they are inherently flawed and a bad person. So scapegoated children tend to believe on a very deep level like something is just wrong with them. They were born into the world with a bad soul that was flawed and kind of messed up. And now anyone who gets too close to them is going to be able to see that. Now, if the child had just been overtly told, I don't love you, I am not treating you the same as your other siblings, I am projecting all of my own issues onto you, the child would at least know what's up. And of course, this would never happen. This is highly, highly unrealistic because the parent themselves usually can't admit to themselves or has no awareness of the fact that they're scapegoating the child, right? They really do believe this child is just a bad kid. But if the child were to have been aware of all of that, they would at least know this is not what love is. This is not what love feels like. This is not what it means to be loved by someone. Because as we'll talk about in a little bit, the scapegoated child often grows up to have extremely dysfunctional relationships where they really are not able to discern what loving behavior is and is not. So what's interesting is that this deeply internalized wound of believing I am bad that is inherent to the scapegoated child is also inherent to the fearful avoidant attachment style. So the difference between, let's say, the anxious attachment style and the fearful avoidant is that the anxious attachment style is often pretty convinced of their own innocence. So they tend to believe everyone else is treating me badly, but I should be treated well. I do deserve to have a different kind of love. And this isn't to be confused with having high self-esteem. Often the anxious attachment style has low self-esteem, but they see their problems as external. The problem with the fearful avoidant is that they've internalized the way people treat them, and they truly do believe at their core, in most cases, I am a bad person. I am evil. I was born into this world with something wrong with me, and anyone who gets close to me is going to see that. So the fearful avoidants have a negative view of self and also a negative view of others. And this often parallels the experience of the scapegoat, who believes that I'm the reason I'm being abused, but also other people are unstable, unpredictable, and I can't trust them. So there's a sense of not being able to trust the self and also not being able to trust other people. And again, this mirrors the experience of the fearful avoidant who has that I am not okay, you are not okay worldview. Now, this doesn't mean that all scapegoats are fearful avoidant. It does not mean that all fearful avoidants were scapegoated. However, there is often a very strong overlap between these two categories. I believe it was Pia Melody, who does awesome work in the field of love addiction and codependency, who paralleled the family roles with the attachment styles, and she found that scapegoat and fearful avoidant was one of the most likely combinations that you would see. So the last thing I want to note about the childhood of the scapegoat is that often the entire family unit is oriented against this one child. So the parent who's doing the scapegoating often enlists the help of the other children by telling them that this child is just the problem child, they're the reason they're not a nice, normal family, and the other children develop a sense of animosity towards the scapegoated child. In particular, the golden child might be enlisted to bully the scapegoated child alongside the parent. And we'll talk about this more when I do a video on the golden child specifically, but they will often grow up feeling intensely guilty and remorseful on some level for the way that they treated the scapegoated child. They may experience secondhand trauma from being enlisted to help in the abuse of another child, or they may spend their lives rationalizing why this was okay, because the other kid was just a bad kid, unlike them. They were a good kid. There's actually a really incredible scene in the TV show This Is Us where you see this exact dynamic play out. So you see Randall, who plays the golden child, explode on Kevin, the scapegoated child, telling him that his childhood was rosy, everything was great, that he has nothing to complain about, and that the issues with addiction he developed as an adult, he was just doing to get attention. And I don't want to throw the blame onto the golden child here. I don't think that's helpful because the golden child is often completely brainwashed by the parent, and they're simply reacting to what they've been taught from a very, very young age. They have a different core wound that we're going to talk about when we get to their video, but it tends to be extremely disorienting for the family scapegoat because they are treated like they are crazy in the family anytime they point at the abuse and call it what it is. So if the scapegoated child starts telling the parent that they're acting unfairly, if the scapegoated child tells anyone outside of the family that the parent is acting unfairly, what will happen is that the entire family will kind of rally up and accuse the scapegoat of being crazy. So the scapegoat might come to be known as kind of the problem child, as the child who maybe is mentally ill in some way. They might get different diagnoses. They're the most likely child to be brought in for psychological help because the parents truly believe we're a nice, normal family. Nothing is wrong with us. It's just this one kid is acting up and we don't know why. The reason the kid is acting up, of course, is because they are being blamed, shamed, abused for things that the parent is projecting onto them. And it's perfectly reasonable for a child to act up in response to that. And again, the child doesn't have the language for this, right? They can't point at the parent and say, you're gaslighting me, you are projecting your own abuse onto me, you are threatened by me because you yourself have an unhealed, disorganized attachment system. The child just knows, I am on the receiving end of a large amount of negative emotion, whether that's shame, whether that's anger, whether that's neglect, and there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to why it happens. So this is, of course, very dysregulating for the child. When they're being blamed for something that doesn't really make any sense, of course, it's a normal child reaction to get really angry, really upset, really frustrated. And then it becomes easy for the rest of the family to point the finger at the child and say, well, look at how much they're acting out. This must be their fault. So there is absolutely, in the purest sense of the term, a lifelong gaslighting process that happens with the scapegoated child. They are continuously being told, you are the reason why we weren't a nice, normal family. You are the one with anger issues. You are the one who is a bad kid. And this process of gaslighting them will often follow them in the family dynamic all the way through to adulthood. So in the adult's life, there are a lot of different ways that the outcomes of this scapegoating abuse can play out. You will, unfortunately, very often see the scapegoated child developing issues with addiction, with emotional regulation. They might deal with eating disorders or other mental illnesses. It is not uncommon for scapegoats to develop complex PTSD, which is a disorder that develops through prolonged interpersonal abuse. And it's possible that all of these mental health conditions will go unnoticed or untreated because the scapegoat doesn't see them as mental health conditions. They see them as a natural extension of themselves, and who they are is a bad person. So of course they have all of these problems. I have a theory, and this is purely speculation, loosely based on personal experience, that scapegoats often get involved in kind of antisocial behaviors like drugs or crime or whatever it is because they have internalized this feeling of I am bad. And so when you believe you are a bad person, when you are presented with a scenario where a bad person would say yes to it, you kind of go, well, I'm the kind of person who is bad, and this is the scenario a bad person would like, so I fit here. And so you'll kind of see them turning to these antisocial tendencies, not because they necessarily want to, but because it fits with their self-perception. The scapegoat has this very deep feeling of, I'm not like other people, I am bad, I'm broken, I'm flawed. So when they meet other people who are kind of on the fringes of society, so maybe someone who is a drug addict, maybe someone who is involved in some sort of crime, they might almost see that person as a mirror and go, oh, here's another person who's bad and broken and flawed like me. And there can actually be a sense of camaraderie and acceptance that they never felt in their family unit when they meet other bad people. So this can lead the scapegoat down a lot of very scary paths because they've kind of divided the world into good and bad people, and they identify as bad. In the worst case scenario, this can lead them to go on to perpetuate cycles of abuse. Now, you might not necessarily see antisocial behavior in adult scapegoats, but what you will almost always see is a pattern of adult relationships that are incredibly dysfunctional. Because the scapegoat never learned what love is, and they have this very convoluted idea in their head of when someone loves you, they also blame you, they project onto you, they get angry at you for things you don't quite understand. So they might end up in a lot of partnerships where they are being blamed and shamed by their partners for things that aren't really theirs to take on, but that part of them that believes that they are inherently bad and just ruin the lives of other people around them, but they don't understand why, feels very validated, right? So I'm going to slow that down and say it again. The family scapegoat as a child comes to believe that something inside of them is broken and bad, and that if anyone gets close to them and really sees them and really knows them, they will accidentally make that person angry, make that person abuse them, make that person behave badly. So scapegoats might be at a very high risk for ending up in abusive relationships in adulthood because this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If someone begins treating them the way that their parent treated them, they believe, well, it must be because they got close enough to me that this thing inside of me that's just inherently bad caused them to become so angry, to be abusive towards me. And this can go on and on forever because the scapegoat doesn't realize that they are not inherently broken. They really think they are. So they don't have the same red flags go off when they get into relationships that other people do because they believe that any abuse they suffer is their own fault. Now, this dynamic is not helped out by the fact that the family usually continues to scapegoat this child well into adulthood. So when you have a dysfunctional family system, unless something really drastic happens, the family usually just continues to function using its unconscious roles until all the family members are dead. Like, save for a giant intervention, and sometimes it takes one child kind of waking up to the dysfunction of the family for that change to start taking place. The roles probably aren't going to change. They might become more sophisticated, and the people involved might find more and more complex ways to play out these roles in socially acceptable forms, but more often than not, the roles themselves will stay what they are. So in adulthood, the scapegoat is still usually treated as kind of the black sheep of the family. And it might be very covert and hard to point a finger at, but it will be there. The family system likely still operates around meeting the needs of the golden child and blaming everything that goes wrong on the scapegoated child. And the more life experiences that both of these children have, the more kind of fodder the family system has, right? The golden child may have grown up with many more opportunities than the scapegoated child because they were treated very differently. The scapegoated child may end up getting into a lot of trouble in their lives because they were not given proper coping skills as they grew up. So the children who were not scapegoated in the family might look like they're living much more functional, much more socially acceptable lives because they probably are. And the scapegoated child will continue to be seen as the family problem. And again, this is usually very subtle. Maybe the family plans get-togethers without consulting the scapegoated child and then claims that things just kind of came together at the last minute and it really wasn't their fault and they weren't being intentionally disclusive, but this might happen over and over again. The family members might provide support to each other in ways that they do not provide support to the scapegoated child and then brush it off as, well, we're all just pretty similar, but you're not really like us, so it would be weird if we had these conversations. There will be a lot of subtle disclusion or prejudices against the scapegoated child, which will be completely and totally denied if they are brought up. So if you are the scapegoat and you bring up the fact that you were treated unequally in your family to your family members, it is an absolute trap because now it gives them the opportunity to point the finger back at you and say, Look at the scapegoat being crazy again. And unfortunately, this gaslighting is unlikely to ever end because the people doing it are not aware of the fact that they are functioning within their own family roles and that their own perceptions are not pure, right? The parent who put the child in the scapegoated role in the first place truly believed that they were doing no wrong. And the entire family has been entrenched in the belief for decades and decades that you are crazy and they are sane. So it's going to be really hard to make your case with your family. And for this reason, I want to talk a little bit about how to cope with the scapegoated role as an adult. And here's where I want to stop and once again say I am not a licensed counselor. So the advice I give here is not clinical advice. It's recommendations based on reading that I have done and tools that I have personally found. But if you recognize yourself in the scapegoated role, you really do need the help of a mental health professional. And that's actually the first piece of advice that I'm going to recommend for people who are dealing with the long-term outcomes of family scapegoating abuse is find a mental health professional who understands family roles and can help you contextualize what you went through. So Alice Miller, who was an absolutely brilliant psychologist, talked a lot about the therapist serving as an enlightened witness to the individual's problems. So what that means is someone who properly understands the context of what you went through, being able to listen to and reflect back to you the reality of the situation when you tell them your perception of it can be extraordinarily healing. Extraordinarily. And for many scapegoats, this might be the first time in their lives that they're able to show up and present their experiences to someone and actually get a radically different perspective on it. Because again, the scapegoat tends to believe that they are bad, they are flawed, something is wrong with them. So they'll even tell the stories of their own lives to other people as though that's the case. So the scapegoat might actually be used to talking to their friends about their problems and over assuming responsibility, or maybe making jokes about their experiences. But they very rarely actually see themselves as victims of abuse. So going to a therapist who can help you contextualize what happened and understand that you were not at fault for this parent projecting their own issues onto you can be healing on a level that I think most scapegoats don't understand is possible. Being in the presence of someone who understands this situation with a zoomed out perspective can completely change the way that you think about yourself. And I also want to acknowledge that therapy is not accessible or available to everyone. So there are a lot of books you can read, and I am going to link them in the description of this video. One that I recommend, actually, let me grab it. I think I have it. I do have it. It's called Rejected, Shamed, and Blamed. And it is by a woman named Rebecca Mandeville, who works specifically with family scapegoats to help them recover from family scapegoating abuse. And this book gives a really good overview of a lot of the different problems that might come up in relation to being the family scapegoat, how they might show up in adulthood, and what you can do to start working through those issues. And she actually also does scapegoat coaching, so you can get in touch with her specifically. Now, if you can't afford coaching or therapy, which I totally recognize a lot of people can't, I think this book is like $10, and I really recommend that you try to get your hands on it because it will help you kind of zoom out and see the situation that you were in for what it was, the way that a really good therapist would otherwise help you see the situation. But let's also talk about the problem of how you're showing up in your family unit as an adult. I can't let you go without giving you another book recommendation. 1 second. This book, Complex PTSD, my ring light is getting in the way of you seeing the title, but Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving, written by Pete Walker. This is one of the best books I have ever read in my life, period. It just gives such an incredible overview of complex PTSD, which again, develops when you have prolonged interpersonal trauma, which can be psychological abuse from family scapegoating. And this isn't to say that if you were the scapegoat, you definitely have complex PTSD. You don't necessarily have it. But in the Scapegoat book, they talk at length about how a lot of scapegoating victims do develop complex PTSD. And if that's something you recognize in yourself, Complex PTSD by Pete Walker is an absolute gem of a book. And what I appreciate about both of these books is that they're very easy reads. Like, they're very accessible. They don't use all of this jargon. These books are so down to earth and they make everything really easy to understand. And they give really great hands-on coping tools. Now, on a practical level, let's talk about what it looks like interpersonally to live with family scapegoating abuse. So we've already talked about the kind of cycle of unstable relationships. If you can't afford professional help, or if you can't afford it, I highly recommend Codependence Anonymous or Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is a support group that is not just focused on adult children of alcoholics. It's focused on adult children of any sort of family dysfunction. So you can go to coda.org or adultchildren.org to check out either of those. They're 12-step programs that are geared around healing interpersonal wounds. And Adult Children specifically talks about reparenting. It talks about family roles. It talks about anyone who grew up in a dysfunctional family and is having trouble coping as an adult. And the groups are all self-organized and completely free. Highly recommend checking them out. So step 1, if you realize that you're in this role, is getting help and support for yourself. Step 2 is looking at how you can manage the relationships that you're already in without making things worse. So chances are, if you're the family scapegoat, you still have a difficult or strained relationship with your family. And there are a lot of different ways to deal with this. Some scapegoats go no contact. Some scapegoats find ways to minimize contact enough that they no longer feel like they're getting triggered constantly by their family. And what you choose to do is up to you. But something that I recommend being very aware of as a scapegoat is the fact that your family members, in many cases including your siblings, have been brainwashed by the parent who put you in the scapegoated role to believe that you are crazy or unwell. And of course, you might have mental health difficulties, right? Many people do. But that doesn't mean that you are incorrectly perceiving your role in the family unit. So I would actually caution scapegoats against trying to confront their family with this information once they realize family roles are a thing and that they were in the scapegoat role, because the most likely thing to happen is that they're going to get badly gaslit for this. They're going to be told that they're crazy, that these things never happened to them, and that can be extraordinarily invalidating when you're already kind of in a raw place. So there kind of has to be an acceptance process that happens where you go, okay, I might never get the validation that I want from my family that this happened. They might never be able to see it themselves. And learning to be okay with that and to take care of yourself despite the fact that the people who put you in this role might never be able to acknowledge it can be a giant act of self-care. So the way I always kind of look at it is you can't hope for external salvation. So it's unreasonable to expect your family to turn around one day and recognize this role that you've been in, but you can hope for internal salvation. So others may never stop seeing you in this role, and they may never stop trying to push you back into the role when you begin stepping out of it. But you can step out of it. You can learn to stop seeing yourself in this role. You can unlearn the idea that you're bad and flawed and that there's something wrong with you. You can stop internally perpetuating your own scapegoated role. That's internal salvation. And that's what you have to focus on first if you want to start healing from scapegoat abuse. You have to start seeing yourself differently and being strong enough in those perceptions to allow them to override the perceptions of your family. And in time, if you're working with a therapist or counselor or engaged on your own healing journey around this, you might start to see your family as wounded individuals as well. So you might be able to recognize that the family roles that your other siblings were forced into also weren't that adaptive or that healthy for them. And you might notice dysfunction or trauma responses that they're suffering as a virtue of their role. You might notice the unhealed dysfunction or trauma of your parents for the first time. And you might finally be able to see that this wasn't a situation where you were being abused because you were bad. You were being abused because hurt people hurt people. And I want to be clear that this is a far cry from saying everything that happened to me was okay and I'm going to instantly forgive my family for everything that happened. If anything, a lot of psychologists suggest that moving too quickly to forgiveness can actually be a way of trying to bypass the work. John Bradshaw is an awesome family therapist who talks a lot about this. He wrote books like Bradshaw on the Family, which go over family roles. He wrote a book called Healing the Shame That Binds You that talks a lot about the process that we have to move through before we're able to fully forgive our parents or our family members for any harm that they caused us. And Alice Miller also talks quite a bit about this. So there are a lot of good resources out there to help you manage the relationships that you currently have with your family while you're healing from the scapegoat role. But the thing that I want to emphasize the most intensely is that you have to be willing to see yourself differently before other people do. You might become the absolute best, most reformed human being on earth, and your family will still find ways to scapegoat you. A classic example in the scene I was talking about earlier, the child who was scapegoated developed an addiction as an adult, became sober, their family came to visit them in rehab, and they were scapegoating the child by telling them you don't really have an addiction. So it might continue to feel like no matter what work you do to reform yourself and become a healthy and well-adjusted person, the family wants to find more and more ways to shove you back into the scapegoat role. And that's something you need to expect and develop strategies around, hopefully with the help of a therapist or coach, so that it doesn't derail you when it happens. Because there can be these kind of redemption fantasies that come up when you're the scapegoat of, I'm going to get my act together, I'm going to become a better person, and then my family is going to see what a good person I am, and they're going to start treating me very differently. But that's not how dysfunctional family systems work. You were always a good person. You just internalized a bad identity, right? So you don't have to get rid of your bad personness to heal from scapegoating abuse. All you have to do is switch your perception and realize that all along you have been a person who is trying their best and who absolutely does not just have a bad, evil soul. And the last suggestion I want to give around this is find people you can surround yourself with who do see that good in you. So there's that old fable where the grandfather is talking about how he has two wolves inside of him, one who is good and righteous and wants what's right for the world, and another one who is evil and wretched and wants to choose things that are not compassionate. And the grandchild asks him which wolf will win in the fight. And the grandfather says, whichever wolf I feed. And it's really important to note that if the trauma you are going through is interpersonal in nature, it has to heal interpersonally as well. You can't heal interpersonal trauma without engaging with other people in new ways. So you have to learn to surround yourself with people who see you not as evil and broken and bad the way your family did, but who see you as good and whole and inherently worthy, because that's how you're going to feed that wolf inside of you. The two wolves inside of you are the wolves of other people's perceptions. So there's one wolf who's been told its whole life, you're bad, you're evil, something's wrong with you, you make other people's lives hell. And there's another wolf inside of you, born out of the perceptions of people who love you, who see you as good and caring and compassionate and trying hard to lead a really honorable life. And you have to surround yourself with as many people as possible who are going to feed that wolf. Because again, you can feed that wolf all day long, and you should, but you're also going to need some help from healthy outsiders because this is an interpersonal trauma. So how much you choose to contact your family and how much you choose to put yourself in a situation where you might be scapegoated is something that you, hopefully with the help of your counselor, are going to have to work out. But the important thing to remember is that you need to surround yourself with people who are feeding the wolf of the goodness in you, because you need reminders of your own goodness. That's normal, that's human, everyone needs that. It's just that most people got it for the majority of their lives in a way that you did not, right? So finding the right help, surrounding yourself with caring and loving friends, and refusing to perpetuate that cycle of internal scapegoating, and refusing to talk to yourself as though you are bad and flawed anymore, are all going to go a long way in starting to change how you think about yourself, which will extend to how you start showing up in the world. Okay, I think that's all I have to say for today about the family scapegoat role. If you find yourself in this role, again, please seek out professional help if you can. If you can't afford it, I highly recommend you check out adultchildren.org. It's a really great resource for people who have been through family dysfunction. And or see if you can get your hands on one of the books that I've recommended in this video. I will put a list in the description. I hope you know that you are not alone in this process, and you don't have to be alone in this process anymore if it feels like you currently are. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I will see you here next time where we're going to talk more about the different family roles.